Hey guys, welcome back to Now I Know. Today we are talking about one of the topic that has been requested many times, and that is pedigree analysis. So we will see what is pedigree analysis, then we will see different types of inheritance pattern, and towards the end I'm going to share some of the tips and tricks that I utilize to pinpoint, looking at the pedigree chart, what type of inheritance it is. Trust me, it's going to be worth it. Stick to the video till the end. We are going to practice, take some examples. Using those tips, we are going to identify the type of inheritance looking at the pedigree chart. So let's begin. So first things first, what is pedigree? What is pedigree analysis? A pedigree is a pictorial representation of a family history, right? Something like this, a family tree, if you would. It's a pictorial representation whereby by looking at which you can identify if there is a particular trait that is running in the family. Say for example, we know the circle means female and square represents male, right? And wherever there is darkened circle or square, that means that particular individual is affected. So here there is one affected male who is transferring or who is passing on that particular trait to next generation. Here you can see females are affected, and then these females are also passing the traits. So a pedigree analysis helps us to understand if there is a particular disease that is being passed on to next generation, or there's particular genes, if you want to say gene or allele that is being passed to the next generation, and if so, what is the probability that the next generation might get it. So genetic counseling is very important. If you have some kind of history of disease in the family, some kind of gene that is running through the family, this pedigree analysis would help a lot to identify if the child would have it, if child might have it, and if so, what is the probability of child having that particular gene or characteristic. So pedigree analysis look at the family tree and try to outline, find out what type of inheritance it is, and whatever inheritance it is, what is the probability that the next generation might get it. Now here we are not talking about the probability part. All we are going to do here in this video is to identify what type of inheritance it is. So for that we need to understand the types of inheritance patterns that can be there. Probability maybe in some other video we will talk about, because if I talk here it is going to be too long video. So let's understand first the inheritance part, and we will see how to identify the inheritance pattern looking at the pedigree chart. This is one of the topics that I have seen students running away. They cannot identify what type of inheritance it is, and they just leave the questions in the exam. Whereas this can actually assure you marks if we have understand the inheritance pattern clearly. Okay, so let's begin with inheritance now. So let's first understand what different types of inheritance patterns can be there. Now we are talking about genetics, we are talking about genes, and genes come from where? From the chromosomes. And for us humans, we have two types of chromosomes, autosomal and sex chromosomes. So that means we can have inheritance that is coming either from autosomes or from sex chromosome. Here we will say this sex linked because it is related to sex chromosome. Now in case of sex linked, again sex chromosomes, we have two types, X and Y. So we will have X linked and Y linked. Alright. Once again we know the concept of dominant and recessive. And why is this dominant and recessive important? Because we are diploid organism. We are going to have two copies of every gene, that means two alleles, and based on what type of allele it is either dominant or recessive. That means either only one copy is enough to express or show the disease. In that case it is dominant, where only one allele is going to express the disease. And in case of recessive, in that case there has to be two alleles present for that particular disease. There has to be two alleles to show the characteristic. So for dominant it can be heterozygous or homozygous condition, any one is going to give us the disease. For recessive it has to be in homozygous condition to show the disease. Similarly, this dominant and recessive also can be there in sex linked, but it will be there only for X linked, right? Because X is the only chromosome that is going to be present in pair in case of female, right? Y is not present anywhere in the pair. It is only in male, that too only one copy is present. Okay, we have talked about this hemizygous concept in one of the previous video. Y chromosome only in male, only one copy. So there cannot be dominant or recessive funda applied over here. That is only given to X-linked. So far we have this autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive and Y-linked. 5 types of inheritance. Can there be anything else other than this? A source of chromosome, a source of genes? Yes, there is. Okay. If we know about maternal inheritance, cytoplasmic inheritance, mitochondrial inheritance, where the genes or the genetic material is contributed exclusively from a female, from a mother to offspring, right? There is also extra chromosomal inheritance that is given from a mother to offspring. So that is also a type of inheritance that we need to consider. That would be number 6. So we have 6 different types of inheritance that we need to look for, that can be source of passing on of a trait in a family. So how, what are the characteristics of each of these inheritance and how we can identify what type of inheritance it is looking at by looking at a pedigree. So let's begin with the first type. Alright, so the first type is autosomal dominance, right? Autosomal means the genes are present on autosome, and dominance means only one allele is enough to show you or give you the disease, right? That is why dominant. So it can be homozygous condition or it can be a heterozygous condition for autosomal dominance. Now since it's a dominant condition, what happens is wherever you will see affected individual, let's say for example, if you see affected individual, this affected individual will for sure have at least one of the parent who is affected, right? That's how this individual has got that particular allele. We are talking about autosome, right? So that's why if you look at a particular individual who is affected in generation, here also, this affected individual will for sure have at least one affected parent. So that is one important point. If I show you this pedigree, look at this affected individual here, one parent is affected, here one parent is affected. Okay. The next point says there is no skipping of generation. Now that is based on the probability, right? Based on homozygous or heterozygous parent, there would be most of the time no skipping of generation because it's a dominant condition. Even one allele is present would express it. So next is male and female are equally likely to be affected. But obvious, right? It is autosomal chromosomes are uniformly distributed in male and female, right? So chances are there that male or female, they are equally likely to be affected. All right. Now, if you see the probability, if an individual is heterozygous who is affected, that means there is only one allele for that particular disease, half of its offspring would be affected. Let me just make it simple. Take a Punnett square. This is the affected individual and the other individual is normal. Look at this. Out of 4, 2. That means 50% is affected and other 50% is going to be normal, right? It's just a probability, a random probability that if the affected individual is heterozygous, half of its offspring is going to be affected. All right. Then if a person is homozygous, what will happen? He is homozygous. Or he or she is homozygous. So definitely he or she is going to pass this to all. At least one will go, right, in assortment. Either this or this allele is going to get transferred. So no matter it is this allele or this allele, either of them would give the disorder. So if the person is homozygous, all the offsprings would be affected, right? Now here I am not telling you all the tips as of now. Let's first understand the basics and then at the end I am going to give you, all jotted points. The next would be autosomal recessive, right? Now autosomal recessive means, that means the genes are present on autosome and it has to be in recessive condition, homozygous recessive condition of course, to show the disease. there has to be two alleles for that particular disease. Again, this is autosomal, so male or female, doesn't matter, they are equally likely to be affected because autosomes are uniformly distributed whether it is male or female. Now, on an average, if there are carrier for this particular, okay, from carrier I remember one point, can there be a carrier for dominant condition in the family? No, right? Because even if one allele is present, it will show the disease. So there cannot be any carrier when you talk about a dominant condition. It comes into picture only when we are talking about a recessive condition, because there has to be two allele. So this particular condition in heterozygous, even though there is one allele, it is not going to show the disease, but it will pass on this allele to the next generation. So this risk of affected individual comes into picture when we are talking about carrier, because it's a recessive condition, is 1/4 or 25%. What do I mean by this is, if there are carrier parents, always make Punnett squared, becomes very easy. Look at this, 1/4 out of 4, one offspring can have this particular disease. It's once again a probability that if you have carrier parents, 1/4 is the probability that the offspring might get the disease. Alright, now since it's a recessive condition, and as I said 1/4 might get from the carrier parents, that means an affected offspring might have both the parents who are unaffected, isn't it? Or the other way around, that the parents are affected but the offspring is not affected. Here there was that was one important point, that affected offspring would for sure have at least one parent who is affected. Here it is not necessary. Look at here, these two in this pedigree are the offsprings who are affected, but look at their parents, they are unaffected. Similarly, here there is affected parent, but all the offsprings are unaffected, isn't it? So there is a skipping of generation. We are observing skipping of generation over here. So when you have this, a peculiar characteristic, when you're looking at a recessive condition, you would see that for few generations maybe there is unaffected offsprings, unaffected parents, and suddenly you will see the trait appearing. It can be sporadic and it is going to be very less compared to what you observe in dominant condition, because it's a recessive condition. Again, if both the parents are affected, that means they are in homozygous condition, both the parents. So definitely all of their offsprings are going to be affected. If affected individual is mated with unaffected homozygous individual, that means affected individual with homozygous unaffected, all their offsprings would be normal, as we can see, but all of them would be carrier for this particular disease, and they will pass this allele to the next generation. Okay, excellent. I find X-linked and now the following ones very interesting to understand. The X-linked means we are talking about the genes that are present on X chromosome. Alright, and dominance means there is even one X chromosome if having that particular allele is enough to show the disease. So for female it can be either this way or this way, heterozygous or homozygous, that's what I mean. But for male it is only going to be this way, right? Because male, we know they are hemizygous, they have only X chromosome, one X chromosome, so one allele, anyways, that is enough for dominant condition. Alright, now one very interesting point here is that the trait or the disease is never passed from affected father to son, and that holds true even for X-linked recessive. And why is this? Because even if there is affected male, male only gives Y chromosome to the son, right? So even if the male is affected, since he gives only Y chromosome to son, the X comes from the mother. If the mother is unaffected, the son will be unaffected. So very peculiar characteristic of X-linked I'm talking about, whether it is dominant or recessive, affected father will never pass on the trait to the son. All the sons will be normal. If at all the son has to get that particular X-linked character, it has to come from the mother, because father is only going to give the Y chromosome. On the other hand, if the affected father is there having daughters, all the daughters will be sure affected. And why is that? Because father gives X chromosome to daughter, and since the father has only one X chromosome which is carrying the dominant allele, no matter how many daughters the father would have, they all are going to get the particular trait, right? So very peculiar character of X-linked dominant, that the sons are not going to be affected. Affected father's sons are not going to be affected, but all the daughters of affected father would be affected. Look at this particular pedigree. There's affected father over here. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids. Out of that, 3 are daughter and 2 are sons. Sons are unaffected totally, but all 3 daughters are affected. Alright. In the next generation, if you see, from affected mother, you see, they have equal chances of their offsprings being affected, because mother is going to give this particular allele to either daughter or son. 50-50 chance, right? So if it is going to son, is going to get affected. If it goes to a daughter, it is going to get affected. Again, if this mother has affected male, this male would have all affected daughters, but son will not be affected. Similarly here, this affected daughter has affected son. This affected father will have all affected daughters, but sons will be absolutely unaffected. A very typical way to identify X-linked dominance. Alright, let's move on. Now this is dominant, right? So there is no skipping of generation, of course. But recessive, there will be skipping of generation, as we saw above. Now since it's a recessive condition, you know, this would be either like this for female, both the alleles. For male, only one is enough, isn't it? Because male is in hemizygous condition, so even one recessive allele is going to act to give you the disease. So in this case, when it is X-linked recessive we are talking about, if you look at it, you will find that males are actually more likely to be affected than female, because for female there has to be a recessive condition, but for male, even if this one allele is present, it is going to show the disease, because male, they are hemizygous. As I said, we have talked about it in one of the previous video. Affected father never passes the trait to son. We just saw it above, because affected father is going to give Y chromosome to son, so all the sons are going to be normal no matter what. But as we saw before, you know, affected father have all affected daughters. Will that be true in this case? No, because we are talking about recessive conditions. So if this male is affected and gives this X chromosome to daughter, and if mother is unaffected, she is going to give this X chromosome which is normal, the daughter is going to be normal, carrier but normal. So in X-linked dominant we saw if the father is affected, all the sons will be normal, but all the daughters will be affected. In case of X-linked recessive, as we just saw, that if the father is affected, no matter what, all the sons are going to be unaffected, and not necessary that all the daughters will be affected. But if a mother is affected, all her sons are going to be affected. Even if the father is normal, father gives the Y chromosome, mother gives this one copy to the son, and that one copy is enough for the son to be affected because they are hemizygous. So if a mother is affected in case of X-linked recessive, all her sons are going to be affected. Contrary to what we saw here, if a father is affected, all the daughters will be affected. In case of recessive, if a mother is affected, all the sons will be affected. So this is what it is. If there is affected mother in X-linked recessive, all her sons are going to be affected. In this generation also, mother is affected, all the sons are affected. Since both the parents are affected, definitely all the offsprings will be also affected. And it's a recessive type. So this mother over here is carrier. She has got one allele from mother, recessive allele, and one normal X chromosome from father, so she's a carrier. But now then she can transfer this allele to next generation, right? So this is how X-linked recessive looks like, and there is one peculiar characteristic about X-linked recessive, that we observe a crisscross inheritance, where what happens is, if you have a normal mother but affected father, they have one female and one male. Male definitely is going to be normal, but female would be carrier, right? She gets this from father and one normal X chromosome from mother. So she is carrier. Now, when she marries a normal partner and when they have kids, the daughters might be either carrier or normal based on what they have got from her mother. Father will obviously give one normal X chromosome. And for son also, based on what X chromosome they are getting from mother, either they'll be affected or unaffected, right? So if you see, there was a characteristic, there was a disease in grandfather through carrier daughter. This is how we show carrier. Through carrier daughter, it was passed on to grandson. This is called criss cross inheritance. From male to carrier female to male, it is passed. The characteristic or the trait is passed. Now let's move on to Y-linked. Now these last two are very easy to understand. We are talking about Y-linked. Not many genes are present on Y, but we are talking about whatever few genes that are present on Y chromosome. So the genes are present on Y chromosome. Since we are talking about Y chromosome, you will see that only males are affected, right? Because female don't have Y chromosome. So only males would be affected. Affected father would have all affected son. No female whatsoever will be affected, and it does not skip a generation. Unless you don't have a son in the generation, it is not going to skip. So we can't say skipping of generation, right, in that case. So if you have affected male, affected father would have all affected son. Okay, this person is from outside, this is the daughter. Daughters will not be affected. If there is affected male, again definitely all his sons would be affected. Daughter, normal sons. Affected son, again he will have affected son. Daughter will be normal no matter what. So Y-linked is very easy to identify. You will see only and only males affected in the pedigree. So it is easy to identify that it is Y-linked. Okay. And the last one is maternal inheritance, where the disease or the trait will pass only from affected mother to all the offsprings, right? Now here it was only father to son, because we are talking about Y chromosome. Females don't get the Y chromosome. But when it is maternal inheritance, whether it is male or female, they both are going to get it from their mother. So if the mother is affected, all her offspring will be affected. But if the father is affected because of maternal inheritance, none of the offspring will be affected, because father does not contribute to maternal inheritance. So if you look at a pedigree where you'll observe a mother who is affected would have all the offsprings that are affected. Now she has one son and one daughter. The son is affected, but none of his offspring are affected, because it's a maternal inheritance and male does not contribute to it. But if the daughter is affected, again she will have all her offsprings affected. Again she has two daughters affected and one son affected. Affected son, again normal kids. But the daughter is affected, again she will have all affected offspring. Now again, if these two are going to get offsprings, they are all going to get affected, but this would have unaffected offspring. So when you see a pedigree where you see females are affected and all her offsprings are affected, and from that again a daughter are having affected offspring, but the sons does not have any affected offsprings, and that has been repeated, you can say that it is maternal inheritance. So that's all about the inheritance. Now we have seen some peculiar points for every type. Now let's look at those tips, jot down those topics, and based on that we are going to solve some examples. Now what I always do is I go in this way, complete reverse way. I rule out, I eliminate one by one the inheritance pattern. The easiest one is to understand the maternal inheritance and Y-linked inheritance, right? Very easy to understand. So first look at the pedigree, see whether it is maternal or Y-linked. If nothing, just rule that out. If it is maternal, you saw that affected mother will have all the offsprings affected, but the affected father will have none of the offsprings affected, because we are talking about maternal inheritance. And if it is a Y-linked inheritance, affected father will have only affected son. Means, in short, in a pedigree you will see only affected male. No female will be affected whatsoever. Eliminate these two. If you don't have these two, move on to the next, that would be X-linked. First look for X-linked dominant. How to look for X-linked dominant? One typical character is, if you see affected father, all the daughters will be affected because it is X-linked and father gives only X to daughter. So if a father is affected, all the daughters will be affected. So X-linked dominant, the typical character is, if you have affected father, all the daughters will be affected. And there will be no skipping of generation, of course, because it is dominant. So rule that out. If it is not so, eliminate it. Move on to X-linked recessive. Typical character for X-linked recessive would be, if you have affected mother, all the sons would be affected. And you will also observe crisscross pattern if present. Look for affected grandfather to a normal daughter. When I say normal, it will be a carrier daughter to affected grandson. Okay, crisscross pattern. If not, eliminate that also. Then we are remaining only with autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. Very easy to understand. If it is autosomal dominant, you will see that almost all the generations are affected and there is equal chance of male and female being affected. If there is individual who is affected, definitely would have at least one parent that is affected. We had seen this. If the affected individual doesn't have at least one affected parent, means you can rule the dominant out. Autosomal dominant we can eliminate. In autosomal recessive, you will see skipping of generation and very sporadic appearance of the trait, and individual who is affected might have unaffected parents or the other way around. Now let's keep these points in mind. These are the tips that would help us to identify. Let's move on and see some of the examples. Alright, so this is one pedigree. Let's identify what type of inheritance it is. The first point, as I said, look at the maternal inheritance. Is it maternal? See, there is a female who is affected, but all her offsprings are not affected. Here there is one son and one daughter who is not affected. If it was maternal inheritance, what was the condition? All her offsprings would be affected, but it is not true. So maternal inheritance ruled out. Is it Y-linked? If it is Y-linked, only the male will be affected in the pedigree. No female whatsoever will be affected. So, of course, we can eliminate Y-linked also. Now, let's come to X-linked, dominant or recessive. If it is X-linked dominant, the condition I said is affected father would have all daughters affected. Okay. So, let's see. There is affected father. We can see over here. Is he having all affected daughters? No, none of the daughters are affected. Look at here also. There is affected father. All the daughters are affected? No, only one is affected. Two daughters are unaffected. So it is not X-linked dominant. Then let's eliminate that and move on to X-linked recessive. The condition of X-linked recessive, one of the very important condition is, if there is affected mother, all her sons would be affected. So let's see. There is affected mother. Is she having all the sons affected? She has two sons. One is affected, but one is normal, right? So it is definitely also not X-linked recessive. Let's rule that out. We are remaining with autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. Is it autosomal dominant? If it is autosomal dominant, one very important condition is affected individual or offspring should for sure have at least one parent who is affected, right? So if you look at this affected offspring, this son has one affected parent. Okay, fine. Look at this. These offsprings have one affected parents. Yes, it has. But look at this particular offspring over here. This offspring is affected. But is this offspring having at least one affected parent? No. This offspring has both the parents who are unaffected. That means it is not autosomal dominant. So eliminate that also out. So we are only remaining with autosomal recessive, where the condition is affected offsprings can have unaffected parents. Right? That is what we are observing. And this is a skipping of generation also. This particular disease is skipping this generation. So this particular pedigree is autosomal recessive. If you look at it just like that, you might conclude it autosomal dominant. But if you go by the rules or the tips that we just saw, you will not make a mistake, right? It is autosomal recessive. Let's move on and take one more example. Alright, look at this particular pedigree now. As I said, first start with maternal inheritance. This particular female over here is affected, right? Yes. Is she having all her offsprings affected? No, she does not. So we can eliminate maternal inheritance right away. Alright. Now let's come to Y-linked. For Y-linked, only the males would be affected. Here females are also affected. Eliminate Y-linked also. Now let's come to X-linked dominant. The condition is affected father to all affected daughters. Here I have one affected father. He has daughters. Are they affected? No, they are not. So eliminate X-linked dominant also. Now X-linked recessive, condition is affected mother would have all affected son. Here I have affected mother, but are all her sons affected? No, she also has normal son. So you can right away eliminate X-linked recessive also. Now we are left with autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. For autosomal dominant, one important condition is if you see affected offspring, at least one affected parent should be there. Okay, let's find out. Here the offsprings are affected, at least one parent is affected, yes. But if you see here affected offspring, there is no affected parent. Here also one more thing, there is affected parent but all the offsprings are normal. So definitely it is not autosomal dominant. Eliminate that also out. So we are left with autosomal recessive. It is autosomal recessive, but again let's look at the point and just confirm. Can you see skipping of generation over here? Can we see skipping of generation over here? Even though you have affected parent, all the offsprings are unaffected. Or the other way around, we have affected offspring, but the parents are unaffected. So it is definitely autosomal recessive, right? So it's an example of autosomal recessive pedigree. Okay, so let's look at this pedigree. Start with maternal inheritance. Now the thing with this pedigree is there is no affected female that I can observe for offspring. Okay, but I can always look at affected male, right? In case of maternal inheritance, if the male is affected, you remember the affected male cannot pass on the maternal inheritance to any of the offspring, right? Because it's a maternal inheritance that we are talking about, which cannot pass on from father. So here there is affected father. Ideally, if it was maternal inheritance, all the offsprings should be unaffected. So you can right away eliminate the maternal inheritance. It is not maternal inheritance. Okay. So maternal inheritance is ruled out. Let's move on to Y-linked inheritance. For Y-linked, if you remember, only the males would be affected. Whatsoever, females cannot be affected. I can see here 2 females, 3 females affected, right? So definitely we can rule out Y-linked. Then X-linked dominant. Peculiar character, affected father would have all affected daughters. Let's see, is it happening? I have affected father. He has 2 daughters. Only one is affected, not all. Eliminate that also out. X-linked recessive. Condition, affected mother would have all affected sons. Now as I said, I can't see here affected mother. Okay, so I'm not sure whether it is X-linked recessive or not. But what I can see is there is no skipping of generation. For it to be recessive, there has to be a skipping of generation, right? So there is no skipping of generation that I'm observing. Also, if you remember, there was a crisscross pattern that we talked about for X-linked recessive. So there is no skipping of generation, and I also don't see a crisscross pattern over here. Grandfather to carrier daughter to grandson. No, I'm not observing. So I can also rule out the X-linked recessive. Then we are remaining with autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. For it to be autosomal dominant, the condition was if the offspring is affected, at least one parent for sure will be affected. Let's see, is it happening? I have affected offspring over here. The affected offspring have at least one parent affected. Yes, it is happening. Again, I have affected offsprings over here. Do they have affected parent at least one? Yes, they have. Again, I have affected offspring. Do they have at least one affected parents? Yes. So chances are there. Moreover, it is not skipping the generation. So it can be autosomal dominant. But let's also eliminate autosomal recessive if we can. For autosomal recessive, we saw that there might be skipping of generation. Most probably skipping of generation will be there. We are not observing skipping of generation. Moreover, the occurrence of this particular phenomena is comparatively more than what we had seen. 1/4 individual would be affected. It is so that means we are looking at autosomal dominant pedigree for sure. Okay, let's move on. So is it maternal inheritance? Let's first check that. Now here there is no affected female to first rule that point out, but there is affected male. All the offsprings are unaffected. Okay, but if you look at this generation after this, again there is a reappearance of the trait. So if it was maternal, this male cannot give it to the offspring, and there cannot be reappearance of that maternal inheritance suddenly in the male. So it is not maternal inheritance. Let's rule that out. Is it Y-linked? No, it is not, because affected male would definitely have affected son. So it is not Y-linked also. Eliminate that. Is it X-linked dominant? For X-linked dominant, all affected father will have affected daughters. Affected father has normal daughters. So eliminate X-linked dominant also. Is it X-linked recessive? For that, affected mother will have all affected son, but here there is no affected mother to actually confirm that point. So what the other point of X-linked recessive is, it skips generation. Of course it is skipping generation, but there is one more typical point that I told you is criss cross inheritance. That means there is affected grandfather would have a carrier daughter, will have affected grandson. So is it happening over here? So I have a affected male over here who has a normal daughter, and then again affected grandson. So this normal daughter is actually a carrier. So I can see appearance of a trait from grandfather through carrier daughter to grandson, right? So there is a crisscross pattern observed. So it is possible that this is X-linked recessive, but still I will try to eliminate autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. Now autosomal dominant says that the affected offspring should have at least one affected parent. So right away you can eliminate autosomal dominant because this offspring does not have affected parent. Not only that, this parent is affected but having all normal offspring. So eliminate autosomal dominant also. We are remaining with autosomal recessive. Now here it's tricky. As I said, recessive, there is skipping of generation, suddenly it is appearing. It can be autosomal recessive. But since we know about the crisscross pattern, as I said, I can see crisscross pattern from grandfather to unaffected daughter, which can be a carrier, and then I can see affected grandson. So precisely it is X-linked recessive. Okay, so look at this pedigree now. First point to rule out maternal inheritance. Is it maternal? You have affected female, but is all her offsprings affected? No. So you can eliminate maternal inheritance right away. Is it Y-linked? No, because there are females also who are affected. So it's definitely not Y-linked. Eliminate that also. Let's come to X-linked dominant. For X-linked dominant, if there is affected father, all his daughters will be affected. So I have affected father. Let's see. All the daughters are affected. Yes, right, all the daughters as a matter of fact here are affected and all the sons are unaffected. So father is affected and none of the sons are affected, but all the daughters are affected. Chances are there that we are looking at X-linked dominant, but let's just confirm it, Then there is affected mother who is equally giving this trait to daughter or son. Alright, now let's see, is it X-linked recessive? Okay, let's rule other out and confirm whether it is X-linked dominant or not. For X-linked recessive, if the mother is affected, all the sons would be affected. So here I have affected mother, but all her sons are not affected. You have normal son also. So I can actually eliminate X-linked recessive. I'm left with autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive. Is it autosomal dominant? The affected offsprings have at least one affected parent, yes. Affected offspring have at least one affected parent, yes. But since it is autosomal, if you remember, male and female are equally likely to be affected. Whereas you can see in this F2 generation here, only exclusively female are affected. None of the male is affected, right? That means it is pointing out more towards the X-linked dominant again. So I can eliminate autosomal dominant also. So is it autosomal recessive? The last one also let's eliminate. No, it cannot be, because we can't see skipping of generation, and we can actually observe 50% or more individuals affected. So it is X-linked dominant. Very peculiar character. Fathers will have all daughters affected, and if a mother is affected, equal chances of daughters and sons to be affected. Alright, let's move on. I'm sure this in just a second you can catch. There is the first thing that we look for is maternal inheritance. For that, if the mother is affected, all her offspring should be affected. We are having all the affected offspring. This mother is affected, all the offsprings are affected. This mother is affected, all her offsprings are affected. Okay. The second point, if the father is affected in case of maternal inheritance, no matter what, all the offsprings of this affected father will be unaffected. Right? Because we are talking about maternal inheritance. This affected father cannot contribute to maternal inheritance. So affected father, all the offsprings are unaffected. Affected father, all the offsprings are unaffected. So we are definitely sure it is maternal inheritance. You need not even go further and look for anything else, because two peculiar characteristics of maternal inheritance are shown in this particular pedigree. Okay, quickly go through this pedigree. You will see mother is affected, all the offsprings are affected. Okay, but wherever again female is affected, all the offsprings are affected, and male is affected, none of the offsprings are affected. See, male is affected, no offspring is affected. Female is affected, all the offsprings are affected. Very typical pedigree of maternal inheritance. Okay, so the last one, look at this pedigree. All you can see is only males are affected. Okay, there is affected father, all the sons are affected. Affected father, all the sons are affected. Affected father, son is affected. That means clearly it is Y-linked trait, right? So that's how we can actually find out what type of inheritance pattern we are observing in a pedigree. If you know the basics of it, if you are clear about all the points that we discuss, it is going to be super easy and fun to actually identify what type of inheritance it is. As I said, you know, go in the reverse order, start from maternal inheritance, work your way through towards autosomal recessive, one by one eliminate, and wherever you find that it is for sure, you know, XYZ type of inheritance, rule out or eliminate other types of inheritance. So that's all for now. I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you next time. Until then, keep learning.